There's been a big resurgence of so-called retro FPSs or boomer shooters over the last couple years. These are just informal names for first-person shooters taking inspiration from older design philosophies that were all about chaotic battles, large arsenals, intricate levels, simple objectives, and running and gunning. With releases such as Doom 4 and Dusk, it's been propelled back into the spotlight again. Today you have a ton of new and indie options, but why not look back in time to find more obscure, overlooked titles in the subgenre? Wouldn't be the first time on the channel I've done that, though maybe that doesn't count since it's kinda like Russian jank Doom 3. Anyways, meet Gunman Chronicles. It's a boomer shooter has effectively become lost to time. Released in late 2000, it was developed by Rewolf Software. You've probably heard of them, as I just told you their name. They made Gunman Chronicles and only Gunman Chronicles. This game started life as a Quake deathmatch mod, interestingly, where it then moved to the Quake 2 engine before finally settling on Gold Source, the engine famously known for Half-Life. The Gold Source version of this game drew enough attention to be endorsed by Valve and published as a retail product. Gunman Chronicles is effectively a Half-Life total conversion with an entire new campaign slapped on top, and a fairly decent campaign at that. It's got all the bells and whistles you'd expect from Gold Source, primarily the ladders and the sadistic hit scanners. Gameplay, at its core, still feels a lot like Half-Life. However, Gunman Chronicles does have a lot of its own flair. It's a little slower paced than most other shooters like it, but it does compensate with a lot of its unique ideas, and its brutality. You aren't coming out of this game without having your sphincter widened at least a little. This game is unobtainable by most means. It's abandonware today. The studios that both made it and published it have been defunct for a long time, and it seems Valve doesn't really care about it. So your current best bet is to, legally acquire a copy via a fellow internet denizen lending it to you. A polite, completely legal exchange of goods, except it's digital and it's free. ModDB. Once you acquire a copy of this game, I'll leave that part up to you, you can install it like any other Half-Life mod. Huck its files into your Half-Life directory, restart Steam, and Gunman Chronicles will appear in your Steam library, easy as easy mode. For whatever reason, it doesn't keep track of your play sessions or time played, but it works otherwise. Ultimately, you do need Half-Life, but if you're looking for obscure shooters, there's no way you don't already have a Steam copy of Half-Life. It's fully functional on my Win 10 system and can be ran with the same settings you'd find on a Steam copy of Half-Life, so I assume it's fully compatible with modern operating systems and most modern hardware. Though I don't know what to tell you if you're one of those hardcore weirdos who plays games in ultra-wide. What kind of lizard eyes do you have? It's time to actually talk about the game now. Just like Half-Life itself, it starts with a really long, drawn-out cart ride. However, this cart ride is then followed up with a tutorial. It's not optional, and it's probably one of the longest introductory segments I've seen in a first-person shooter from this era. Thank goodness for host frame rate. I'm gonna be honest, I'm not exactly sure what the story is in this game. I guess you're part of the Gunmen, which seem to be some kind of space military group that totally don't look like Confederates. It is weird that I've now covered 2 games in a row where you play as a states' rights advocate. Maybe it'll become a trend. Anyways, our protagonist, John Archer Gunman, did something before the events of this game that made him a hero. Something like issuing an evacuation order after losing contact with his general. At the start, John Gunman is sent to a dinosaur planet where he encounters his former general, who is angry that John Gunman got all the credit for whatever he did. The general has apparently formed an army of alien mutants and wants to wipe out the Gunmen, so you have to single-handedly wipe out him, his mutants, and his pet dinosaurs. Apparently the general was eaten by a giant worm but survived because the worm was silicon-based or something like that. Sounds like some good sci-fi schlock. So I'll buy it. Leave a comment if silicon life forms aren't able to digest people. Anyways, this guy is so angry that his fellow gunman thought he was dead that he needs to wipe out the gunman. Yeah, this is giving me some Saturday morning cartoon vibes. It's just the right combination of weird, nonsensical, and juvenile. I can take it. It's a first-person shooter released in 2000, so naturally it's fairly light on story, but it's definitely heavier than average. There's actually dialogue, some cutscenes, characters, and you actually know who the main antagonist is long before you take him on. Hint, hint. You can probably tell by looking, but his appearance is an indication that he's not a giant floating space baby. Though in fairness, he sure acts like one. He at least has some presence throughout the game, too. Not that he makes for a good final boss fight anyways. This game is artistically quite distinct. I have the unshakable belief that the art designers pulled a bunch of 5-year-olds on what they thought was cool and then put all those things into the game. Dinosaurs, cowboys, the Civil War, laser pistols, moon bases, tanks. Yep, they're all here. I probably did fantasize about a game like this when I was 5. I respect anything that can mix all these random things together as pleasantly as Gunman Chronicles does. Plus, I really like the idea of a dinosaur planet, but in reality, we'd encounter a crab planet first. This game runs on a Gold Source engine, best known for Half-Life 1. The engine itself didn't age too gracefully, but it can still be used to good effect. I think Gunman Chronicles is the best looking game running on this relatively vanilla, unmodified version of the engine by far. Now, in my title I call this a space cowboy game, but that's ultimately really only true for about a third of it. It's intended to be a consistent undertone throughout the game, but in a decent chunk of it, it's easy to forget. How are the actual space cowboy bits themselves? Well, a lot of the human enemies wear cowboy hats and dual-wield laser pistols. You also get to battle your way through Old West-themed environments using said laser pistols, so that counts for something. They don't go headlong with it, but it is a rather refreshing idea. I can't help but love the contrast between a homing rocket launcher and a saloon. The canyons themselves can look a bit bland, but they did good for a setting that's relatively unexplored by most media. I wouldn't say it's a highlight of the game's visuals, however. The second chapter of the game looks great. It's some kind of moon base that makes heavy use of colored lighting. It has a great feel, and it gives me a bit of a Doom 64 vibe. There's a good attention to detail in a lot of these environments, and it feels like it keeps changing up in minor ways. However, again, don't forget that this was intended to be a space cowboy game. Going through a tech base on a moon, primarily fighting robots and mutants, it's easy to forget that you were shooting dinosaurs and dudes in cowboy hats half an hour prior. To be honest, I'm not sure if this ultimately means the game is artistically highly varied or if it's artistically confused. Either way, it still makes for a unique experience. Weapons look great for the time, with the only real visual hiccup across any of them being the subpar texturing on the Polaris blade. What is this ugly reflective texture? It's a sparkly clean killing machine, I suppose. This old school reflective texturing stands out like a sore thumb to me. This game actually aged fairly well in the visuals department, but this is a standout exception. Also, what is this spinny bit on a machine gun? Does it apply spin to the bullets, thus improving its rate of fire? Who knows? Oh, and I think this is among the first games to feature true dismemberment. It's pretty minor though, just human enemies being decapitated on headshots. It's fairly well executed. But there is an oddity with it that I'll address in the sound design section. So the only real problems with the visuals are things that were primarily out of the developer's control, so technical constraints such as texture quality and model quality at times. The ugliest looking thing in the game was consistently the skyboxes, which really need to be a bit higher resolution. That's just really crusty looking. Why is the main menu so crusty looking? Let's move on to gameplay for now. This game is a lot like other old school FPS games in that you carry a small arsenal on you at all times. There are 8 weapons in total, but because of the weapon configuration system, it effectively has way more. Let's talk about this mechanic. It's the gimmick that sets this game apart from almost any other shooter. At any given moment, you can right click to open a Crysis-esque menu to reconfigure your weapon. Some weapons have more options than others, with the rocket launcher being highly customizable, but the machine gun effectively only having 2 firing modes. What you configure is dependent upon the weapon, so nearly every weapon has a completely different set of ways to alter it. Want your rocket launcher to fire homing cluster bombs? Sure, why not? Want to turn your Polaris blade into a chain lightning taser? I mean, I guess you can. Like I said, every weapon is effectively a ton of different weapons in one, most notably with the pistol, Polaris blade, rocket launcher, and the chemical gun. It's a cool idea, and it saw plenty of use and experimentation throughout my playthroughs. At a bare minimum, it's a novelty far ahead of its time, but it certainly isn't without flaws. Some modes are much more useful than others. A short-range ball of lightning from the Polaris blade will instantly kill you, for instance. An attractive idea is the ability to fire 4 shells out of your shotgun at once, but it's unfortunately close to meaningless. The game was obviously balanced around you firing 4 shells at once, so a lot of enemies will effectively take 8 shells to take down, just like old Yeller. While it is a minority of the time, some modes are totally useless or rendered obsolete by other modes. The pistol sniper mode, for instance, curb stomps the other modes in terms of power, ammo efficiency, range, and utility. Why use any other mode? And the chemical gun is extremely unintuitive in what it would do. Like, what do you think increasing any of these will do? Do you know what a gun with a pH of 7 would do? That's roughly the pH of water, so I just say it's a glorified squirt gun. Apparently, an extremely basic gun is effectively a grenade launcher. I would have said it's an AK. But the biggest issue I have overall is that the system is basically unusable mid-combat. The controls to navigate the menu are awkward and clunky, making it completely impractical to try switching modes when a machine gunner is charging you down. It's possible, but you leave yourself completely open if you don't know what you're doing. It's a lot worse with weapons like the rocket launcher, where there's a ton more options and thus more to cycle through. If you happen to have an important weapon configured wrong before a difficult fight, it's hard to recover from. I think this could have easily been solved by having time slow down when you configure your weapon, so you actually have time to think it through, and so that you can do it in mid-combat without completely exposing yourself for a prolonged period of time. So now I've addressed the configuration gimmick, I want to at least address the weapons themselves. It's a good, novel arsenal overall. I switch between all my weapons a lot more often than usual here, so no single weapon slot ever truly fell out of use. A great strategy for a lot of enemies is to hit them with a quad barrel shotgun blast and then finish them off with a machine gun. But hey, you can always burst out a homing rocket or a machine pistol if you feel like it. The game is generous with ammo for the most part, but it becomes a lot more punishing once you reach the labs close to the end, in the 4th act. I personally really like the weapons in this game for the most part. As I said, there's typically a definitive firing mode to use for a good few of the weapons. Some are nothing but fun variations overall, such as the Polaris Blade. It either fires a constant beam, shoots out chain lightning, or it can act as this game's BFG, where it fires out an extremely powerful ball of lightning and behaves like a quirkier version of the Doom 4 BFG. What is interesting is that you'll mostly only use it in the 2nd act of the game, as you lose it at the start of the 3rd act and don't get it again until the final map. I like it when games portion out their arsenal like this because it makes each act feel that much more distinct. Anyways, the Polaris Blade is crazy powerful. It tears through enemies like a fully auto quadruple laser chainsaw of double-decker Omega Death. Probably among my all-time favorite video game weapons, period. The machine gun hits harder than you'd expect, the shotgun feels good to use despite what I've said, the rocket launcher is ridiculously versatile, and so forth. Overall, the only firing modes never worth using are the pulse and phaser firing modes for the pistol. Almost everything else is viable and fun to use. Go ham, make ham. The level design in this game can be a bit of a mixed bag. There are some good encounters to be had, but I think it's weaker than average for the most part. The arenas are lacking in both verticality and circular navigability, and tend to have major bottlenecks at their entrances. This means that a lot of fights in this game are fought primarily from the door that you entered the room from, or from around the corner. This isn't always the case, but the overwhelming majority of battles against hit scanners in particular were like this. A lot of the arenas are heavy on corridors. I think this is especially a problem in the latter half of the game, but the first half of it isn't safe from it either. The canyon section is a major problem with it effectively being a massive glorified corridor half the time. Most battles don't take place in corridors, but you'll still see a lot of them. It's rather uninspired overall, and most of Gunman Chronicles' contemporaries are way better in terms of general encounter design. This game prominently features what I nicknamed AEPs, short for Awful Environmental Puzzles. I've made the executive decision to call them HEPs now, short for Horrible Environmental Puzzles. The abbreviation HEP, or HEP, probably conjures some bad things to mind, so I think it's more fitting. Anyways, it describes environmental puzzles that are unintuitive or horribly communicated to the player. This game is probably the least sinful overall of the 3 games on my channel to feature them, but what it does pull is still highly puzzling, and probably not in the way the developers intended them to be. This tree right here, it sunk up a lot more time than it reasonably should have. You have to battle a guy with a rocket launcher to get up here, so wouldn't you expect to need to use your rockets to knock the tree over and form a bridge? Nope. Rockets do nothing to it. You're expected to backtrack a fairly long distance to reach your tank and blow it down, only so that you can retrace your steps all the way back up and cross the tree. The intended solution was so mind-blowingly stupid from a game design perspective that it didn't occur to me. I ended up assuming it was glitched and just rocket jumped across. Hey wait, an AEP about knocking a tree over. That sounds familiar. Oh yeah, there's the tank. You get to use it extensively in the 3rd act of the game, but you only get to use it about 30 seconds a pop every other time it shows up. It's a fun and ambitious idea for a pre-Halo title, just the same that I find the on-foot segments a lot more compelling. Also, Duke Nukem Forever ripped this part off. You're piloting a vehicle through a canyon with a western theme, and you occasionally have to stop at scripted points where it runs out of gas for no reason. I've sometimes lumped enemy design in with level design, often because they reasonably should go hand in hand, so I'll discuss it here. It's one of the biggest problems this game faces. This game is heavy on both dangerous hit scanners and cruel homing projectiles. Enemies are typically either immensely threatening or complete pushovers. Corner fighting is consistently one of the best solutions to combat encounters because of this design. Compounding these problems is the fact that the game actually has some pretty good ideas with some of its enemy design, but never really uses these properly. One of my favorite examples of this is the Velociraptors, who appear predominantly in the 1st act. You have some encounters with them where they can move between holes in the walls, making it rather unpredictable where they'll strike you from. I like this idea, so it's a shame the game uses it for, 2 quick skirmishes in total? The worst problem of all is the thing that turned me off from replaying this game for so long. The homing projectiles. This game has some of the nastiest homing I've ever seen. Most of them will turn 90-degree corners. Not helping this is the fact that these homing projectiles either hit like a truck or come at you in massive shmup-style barrages. This is the other half of the reason why a lot of this game is corner fighting, because you want a corner to hide behind when a homing rocket is about to cheap you out. The worst instance of it is this boss in particular. There's a couple bosses throughout the game, and this is really the only one worth talking about. I had a much easier time with it this playthrough because I knew it was coming and busted out the full power BFG, but it fires out a ludicrous, almost non-stop barrage of homing projectiles with very little in the way of safe haven. These crates aren't safe because of the sheer intensity of the homing, so what can you really do except run around and pray? This is easily one of the worst boss fights in first-person shooter history, since you're almost completely helpless and it's little more than an unsatisfying damage rush. Thankfully, nothing else in the game is as remotely awful as this. Also, it's the most crashing-prone thing in the entire game too, so that doesn't help his case. As I mentioned before, there are also hit scanners. They're a lot nastier here than they were in Half-Life, despite having the same janky AI and no grenade launchers. These guys with the machine guns are horrible thanks to their high all-around stats. They can just dump damage on you pretty easily. The dudes who dual-wield pistols are tolerable, but they have a psychic instinct for where your crosshair is. The animator also had some kind of malicious intent by making their heads jerk around a lot. Thanks for not standing still. I should loop back to mention that health and armor can be rare in this game. Armor generally feels like it only appears once every 20 or so minutes, with no pickups except for a full restore. Armor is very useful, so you do want to try preserving it. Health stations are rather rare in this game and change in appearance with each act, which is a nice touch, but it also makes them harder to spot. The game isn't too punishing with resources and you can reasonably get away with some aggressive play, but it's overall another contributing factor to all the corner fighting and sniper rifle cheesage. So overall, the level design is serviceable more so than anything else. It's not spectacular nor offensive, instead meandering somewhere in the trenches of mediocrity. I simply don't have strong feelings towards it either way. Enemy design, on the other hand, can be pretty bad, and it typically doesn't complement the level design very well. As a result, I'd say it's a net negative overall here. The sound design in this game is honestly rather unremarkable. It's simply another one of those games where I don't have too much to say. It's generally serviceable stuff that gets the job done. Guns sound fairly good, enemies have distinct callouts, most of the sound choices make sense, voice acting for the major characters is good for the time, yada yada. The primary problem is that the game can be very loud, and that's after turning my sound effects way down in the menu. A lot of environmental noise, especially from machinery, can be ear-blisteringly loud. Operating a tank is a non-stop assault on the ears, especially because the turrets in a canyon are already ridiculously loud. Another unwarranted violation of my earholes are the invisible stalker enemies, whose screams can probably be heard by all dogs within a mile, even if I'm wearing headphones. There's other instances of poor audio mixing like this, but these were the worst to me. One thing I do want to especially note is that this game does commit another sin, and it's that there's not much recorded dialogue for the human enemies. The things that happen horseshoe around from being really dumb to being really funny. I love how you can shoot a dude's head clean off, only for him to somehow clearly gurgle out, "I can take it." It's a weirdly perfect middle ground between being obnoxious and funny. They probably didn't intend for this to happen, but it's incredibly amusing and charming nonetheless. Anyways, the spoilers are about to begin, so go to a timestamp on screen to skip them. I'm not really sure why you'd care since this game's story isn't what you'd be playing it for. Still, I do this out of courtesy. You still there? The people who left couldn't take it. So, the start of this game has you being ambushed by the protagonist's former general, who is angry that Gunman saved the day instead of him, or something like that. Now he's capturing dinosaurs and creating mutants to completely annihilate the Gunman. Like I said, Saturday morning cartoon villain. Captain Planet never shows up, so we have to show him the power of heart using bullets instead. You then hitch a ride on a cargo ship and end up on a moon, where he's creating his mutants. You meet the mainframe here. She's totally not crazy at all and is very trustworthy.
I am the mainframe in control of this facility, and you are dead.
That's why you form an alliance with her and take her to the Wild West planet, Texas Prime. That's apparently where the General's other lab is, because what kind of supervillain would he be if he only had a moon lab? Anyways, you destroy his lab, unleash a worm, and then...
Who are you?
Get out of my way.
No, I don't like your new look. Yeah, this mainframe AI went from being represented by a glowing red eye to being a dominatrix sex bot. Why does an AI need sex appeal in the form of breasts? And who's gonna make a 10-minute long video on the lore behind them? Also, we better add this to the booba counter. Thief 4, Operation Matriarchy, Battle Spire, and now this. 8 points in total. After the robot milkers incident, you then must work your way to General, who gets in a mech to fight you. Well, you don't really fight him. You get in a tank for about 30 seconds to blow off his arm, run towards a giant mech on foot because intuitive design, and then you have to do a short wave defense segment that breaks if you mess up even slightly. Yeah, there's no real final boss here. The wave defense segment also has nothing to shoot at half the time. It's very obviously unpolished. The General then gets vored by the Alaskan bullworm that ate him before the events of the game. Since he survived it the first time, I'm not sure what would be preventing him from surviving it a second time. You then get a vague send-off from the mainframe AI, and then I guess you get picked up by the remnants of the Gunman. Then literally nothing happens for the rest of the cutscene and it hard cuts to credits. I get that shooters this era were typically light on story, I don't mind that at all, but what a boring ending. It feels like Darkest of Days where the ending just kinda cuts off abruptly and it was originally planned to have more substance and closure. It's heavier on story and lower than average FPS at the time, so I expected more. Oh well. So, what are my concluding thoughts on Gunman Chronicles? It's a good game. One of the best on my channel up to this point. It's a fun 4 or so hour long old school romp that could easily kill an afternoon. It does lose me a little bit later on, but the rest of the game is fun and quite original. There's not much like it to this day, and most games that do feature similar ideas feel like dull imitations. Crysis' weapon customization, for example, has nothing on the wacky rocket launcher shenanigans that occur here. I do wish we had more games like this with a unique variety in settings, the weapon configuration system, the old school shooter gameplay, and so forth. I think Space Cowboy games are barely a thing in the first place, and even this game doesn't take too deep of a dive into the setting. Imagine a whole game about cowboys with laser guns. I'd probably play it in a heartbeat. Gunman Chronicles is overall rough around the edges, but for the time, this was probably among the most impressive mods out there. It's also an early instance of the work of passionate modders being sold retail, though the infamous TNT Evolution greatly predates it. Selling what is effectively a total conversion was controversial, even back then. This game saw pretty mixed reception at the time, and noticeably received lower ratings from those who viewed it as a mod being sold retail. As stated much earlier in the video, it's now abandonware. It's not sold in any digital market, and physical copies aren't being produced anymore. You can still get it through somewhat dubious means. There's nothing inherently morally wrong with doing your part to conserve games. It's a real shame that it's being lost to time, but it's at least pretty easy to acquire and play if you have the know-how. Oh, and here's one little fun thing I want to address before I close the video off. Back in 2007, there was a famous Halo 3 leak featuring this picture. This picture depicts a creature from Gunman Chronicles. It does kind of fit the Halo aesthetic, actually. This game deserves recognition for more than an ancient hoax, though, that's for sure. This is actually where I originally learned this game from. Sometimes good things do come from hoaxes. That's it for today's episode. Tune in next time for goodness knows what. Part of the fun is the unpredictability. You can pretty safely wager that'll be another first-person shooter. Might be an exceptionally Russian one, but we'll have to see. See you then.
I want to die!